Our three speakers have been involved in our community in various ways. And so we invite them up to share a few of their reflections. I'm going to begin by inviting Naomi Sachs, who's been recently involved in our Parsha class, our Parshat Shavuot, our weekly Torah class.
Today, I'm going to remember my grandmother, Ida Volinsky, who died in March of 1984. I was 32, married, with a 3-month-old baby daughter. We went to New York for her funeral and then to Long Island for her burial in the IWO International Workers Order section of a large Jewish cemetery. My 2 brothers and I, her only grandchildren, were there, as was my father, her son-in-law. My mother, her only child, had died several years earlier. Grandma had lived a long life, deteriorated before she died, and we were ready to say goodbye. Grandma was born Chaya Malka Grodzansky in Gunians, a small town with a sizable Jewish community in what is now northern Poland. The youngest of 13 children, Grandma was barely a teenager when she came to America on a vacation to babysit for her 2 brothers. The family story goes like this. During her visit, war broke out in Eastern Europe and Grandma could not return home. She stayed and married. She was still in her teens when my mother was born in 1915. I have a trove of essays that she wrote when she took classes to improve her English. In one, she writes, "I couldn't continue school because I had to support myself. I was only 14 years old, inexperienced, no references. I finally found a job in a ladies' waste factory. I worked a few weeks and was laid off. I struggled for 3 years, constantly looking for a new job until my folks decided I should get married. The marriage didn't last. My grandfather regularly stayed out all night, gambling, drinking, and womanizing. In 1922, when my mother was 7, Grandma divorced my grandfather, went to work in a factory, and placed my mother in foster care. Around this time, she gave up on religion, saying that God had been so bad to her that it didn't matter whether she believed in him or not. Grandma retrieved my mother from foster care several years later, and she and my mother lived together well into my mother's adulthood. Each summer, they traveled up the Hudson River by boat from New York City to Albany, spending July and August on my great uncle's farm. Back in the city, Grandma had bought my mother a piano. My mother was a gifted pianist, and when she finished high school in 1931, her teacher wanted her not to go to college and study professionally. But Grandma insisted that her daughter continue her education. My mother finished college and eventually went on to graduate school, earning her PhD. Grandma could not have been prouder. When she was nearly 50, Grandma married Borak Volinsky, a widower who worked for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Grandma and Borak moved into a brand new 2-bedroom apartment in Stuyvesant Town in Lower Manhattan. Grandma loved the apartment and the oval, the green space away from the noisy streets where she would sit for hours in the sun, chatting with friends in Yiddish. And Grandma and Borak adored each other. He gave her greeting cards for any celebratory occasion. Some were humorous, none deprecating. Each was inscribed to his beloved Ida. After Borak died, Grandma kept the greeting cards in a basket next to her living room sofa, and she wore her engagement and wedding rings every day. I loved the greeting cards and the unalloyed joy of Borak's notes to Grandma. I visited Grandma often, sometimes spending the night in her apartment. Sometimes we sat on her living room sofa and I played solitaire, she teaching me the rules of the game and giving me guidance on how to play so that one's chances of winning were increased. Full disclosure, I still play solitaire and I still follow those guidelines. Grandma's life had a wonderful order to it. I would watch her do her hair in the mornings, carefully and deftly making 2 braids and pinning them to the top of her head. And she and I chatted. I remember standing in her hallway and asking her about her family back in Europe. "How old was your mother when she died?" I asked. 94, she replied. "What did she die of?" I would ask. "Hitler killed her," was Grandma's simple reply. It wasn't until several years after she was gone that I realized that Hitler had killed most of Grandma's family. She never spoke of that loss. When I was in 1st grade, Grandma traveled to Israel, spending 2 months with Penina, a relative with whom she had connected after the war. Grandma wrote home regularly, sharing concerns about her grandchildren. Naomi had had the measles, and her delight in the country. "I have so much to talk about," she wrote. Panini came with a boat to the ship, and from far away she saw me and called, Tanti, Tanti, aunt, aunt, so many times, and I looked at her and wasn't very sure. As she came nearer to my ship, I heard her say, Panini, Panini. Then I was sure it is her, but couldn't get over it the way she recognized me. My grandma was thrilled with the still new country, Israel. I am on a vacation, she wrote, and seeing a world, I still can't believe it is me. To me, it should happen such a thing. Even as a child, I knew her trip to Israel was redemptive. Not long after Grandma's return from Israel, my parents and I traveled to Brookline for a family bat mitzvah. Grandma, who had not set foot in a shul for nearly 40 years, was appalled when she entered Temple Israel in Brookline, a Reform synagogue where women sat next to men. What's this? She explained. If you're going to do it, you do it right. Otherwise, you don't do it at all. That year, like all others during my childhood, we went to Grandma's for Pesach. I remember walking down First Avenue dressed up, the scent of spring in the air. Borach had died a few years earlier, but Grandma remained close to his family, and they all always joined us for the holiday. Grandma served a traditional meal, and the youngest among us, me for many years, would ask the 4 questions. Grandma loved people. She was genial and positive. She had many suitors, she told me, but turned them down. On a visit to her Stuyvesant Town apartment when I was in college, I asked Grandma why she hadn't remarried. I don't want to get married, she said. I don't want to have to take care of a man. When I first met Mark, I called my parents to tell them of what I suspected was to be a serious relationship. Little did I know. Grandma was visiting and joined the phone call, interrupting my news. Naomi, she said, I met a man. He wants to marry me. And so 6 weeks later, Grandma married Ed Levy in Ferndale, New York, a small town in the Catskills. An Orthodox rabbi officiated, and after the wedding ceremony, the men sat around a long table with Ed Levy and his new bride, Grandma, drinking schnapps. No other women were at the table, but Grandma beckoned my brother's wife, my sister-in-law, and insisted she join them. The newly married couple stayed in Ferndale until the weather turned cold and then went south to Florida for the winter. Not long after Grandma and Ed's wedding, however, my mother was diagnosed with a recurrence of the breast cancer she had been treated for years earlier. Her prognosis was grim, but she kept the news of her illness from her mother, hoping against hope she would survive. My mother died barely 10 months after Ed and Grandma's marriage, and Grandma could not recover from losing her daughter when she was 81 and my mother 64. Tochter, Grandma said to her as my mother lay in bed, unable to work, sleeping, barely eating. Tochter, she said, reverting to her native Yiddish, capturing what no words in English could convey. Grandma, who had a child when she was 17, far from family, married to a man who betrayed her, never wavered in her devotion to her daughter. Tochter. I have wondered how I, a woman in a conservative synagogue, can be true to my grandmother while keeping her memory alive. I have come to this. If Grandma were to roll her eyes at me for observing in the religious observances she disdained, if she were to dismiss me for honoring her, she and I can have a chat. I will thank her for ensuring that I never once questioned my ability as a woman to have an education or a career. I will thank her for showing me perseverance, pride, and joy in family, and for her cheerfulness in the face of the many challenges life delivered her. I will thank her for her fighting spirit. I will tell her that I loved her and that her light, her legacy, her people, and our traditions live on.
Yasher Koach. Thank you so much, Naomi, for bringing your grandmother's memory to life. May her memory be for a blessing. Invite up our second speaker, Chris Cook, who is part of our community, especially on Friday nights, where he's a regular, and to share a little bit about his journey.
Good morning.
Good morning. Chag Sameach.
I'm going to focus my brief remarks on my mother. Her name was Wanda, and she died last year at the age of 95. She died really at the zenith of COVID, although she did not die of COVID. She had cancer. And my mother was a wonderful woman and very interesting in many ways. She was very bright. She was going to go to Wellesley as a child. That's where her mother wanted her to go. She was very close to her father, and her father was a businessman. And as my mother told the story later, she said, I don't think I'm going to learn anything useful in the liberal arts. I want to be in business. And this was in the 40s. So her father said, well, then find a business school. So she went to Simmons. She graduated magna cum laude. She was fluent in 3 languages. She was president of her class. She had a great sense of humor. She was a very generous woman, and she was so good to everyone she met. When I was a child, I always had a job. And my mother would always take a piece of the action. I had a paper route when I was 11, and I remember the first time the issue came up. She said, how much did you make this week? And I'm sure it was $1. And she said, well, you owe me 20 cents. And I was a kid. I mean, when you're a kid, everything's free. What are you talking about? And she said, you're eating, you're living, you have a good life, and you have to pay something. So I paid her. Every week, as time went on and I began to make a little more money, she would take more money from me. I went to college and I came home, got a somewhat decent job and continued to live at home through part of my 20s. She'd continue to sit me down and the same question, how much did you make this week? One time I said, Mom, it's like living with the mob. I can't hide. You know where I live. You know I've got money, and we both know you're going to get a piece of it. To which she said, very funny, I'll pay up. Later in life, when I married, on my wedding day, my mother handed me an envelope. She had invested every penny I gave her since the age of 11. And she was a good business person, and she did well. Every penny I gave her, she invested and handed it all to me. That's the type of woman she was. Well, she would occasionally get sick in her later years. My father died when she was in her late 80s, and she'd go to the hospital for various issues. Now, when she'd go to the hospital, my brother and I would be on the scene, and we would infiltrate the operation. We'd get to know who the shift supervisors are. We'd find out who the nurses on duty would be. If the nurses station didn't have enough soda, we made sure they got it. If they liked pizza at night, we made sure they got pizza. We always had somebody in the room with her, even if we took vacation time. Now, did that mean she got better medical care? Who knows? We like to think it was true, but probably not. But what it did do was it let our mother know she was never forgotten. Never once did we want her to feel, lying in a hospital bed, that she was forgotten, because she wasn't. One day she said to my brother and I, why do you boys make such a fuss? After we had reviewed with her what we were doing and what we had provided, and my brother said, that's what you get for being a good mother. And she smiled. Well, she was hospitalized during COVID. And this is a sad part of the story, but it doesn't last long. We couldn't go to see her. We couldn't provide the usual gratuities we provided. We couldn't do anything. And it was chaos back then. Some nurses would say you can FaceTime. Other nurses would say she's not even allowed to use the phone. At one point, there was a coding error. She was dying of cancer and they couldn't give her morphine because she was coded no narcotics for some bizarre reason. It took us a day to fix it. And we realized that my mother was going to be treated as she was, a dying old woman, and attention was properly being given to those who could perhaps be saved. And it was hard. It was very hard to be able to do nothing because I do not handle inaction well. At times I would drive to the hospital and just walk around on the sidewalk. And I didn't pray for my mother to get better because I knew she wasn't going to get better. I just constantly prayed that she not feel forgotten. That even though she is alone and at times delirious, that she never feels that she is an old woman in a hospital bed alone. And of course, I don't know how she felt. So after she died, it became time to mourn. Well, I'm a convert to Judaism, and anybody that heard my Hebrew 10 minutes ago already knows that. And so I learned things like Kaddish late in life. Most of you heard the words from childhood. So my brain in learning was old. So I learned it from a different perspective in life. And what struck me is nobody dies. There's no death mentioned. There's no mourning referred to. It seemed to be terribly misnamed. I didn't question it. Well, this is the beautiful thing I learned as a convert. And, by the way, I digress. People think that I converted because I married a Jew. But long before I met my beautiful wife, Ellen, it's something I had studied and contemplated. I sometimes think my soul was waiting to meet Rabbi Lerner because he was so helpful to me. In any event, now, I said Kaddish for the first time as a mourner. And I immediately understood why it is for mourning. Because for me, I felt an almost tangible feeling, a reminder that God has not forgotten me. Those words that I would speak, in my mind, were an expression of my connection with God. And God not forgetting me. And of course, my not forgetting him. And it helped me also deal with the tremendous, tremendous horror that I felt that my mother felt neglected. And I understood better why we say Kaddish for those who died. And I felt, and it helped me to remember that God did not forget my mother. And that I believe she did not die feeling neglected. And I will tell you that reciting Kaddish helped to focus my mind spiritually so that intellectually I was able to grasp it and deal with it perhaps better. And that's my story.
Mr. Koch. Thank you so much, Chris, for bringing your mother's memory and your journey to all of us. Going to invite up Rachel Fish, who's going to share some of her reflections. As many of you know, Rachel's been involved in the community, especially teaching all of us, adults and our teens, about anti-Semitism in recent times. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Rabbi Lerner. Chag Sameach. Thank you for the opportunity for me to share some of the memories of my father, Charles Abraham Fish, Avraham Betzalel. He died almost 18 months ago, and it was his birthday a few weeks ago. So of course we had Grater's ice cream in his memory. So I'm going to share a few memories. And these are some of the incredible components that were baked into my father's DNA. My father believed the Jewish people in Israel were models of perseverance, a people faced with the pressures of assimilation and anti-Semitism, yet never giving up and retaining a sense of collective identity in spite of all the external factors. A people that easily could have played the role of victim, yet remained committed to Emil Fackenheim's articulation of the 614th commandment, the commandment to survive as Jews. Fackenheim believed that the education of each Jewish child was a victory over forgetting and over darkness. This was part of my father's understanding of what makes the Jewish people persist and why Israel is ever evolving as a laboratory of the Jewish people. Because I grew up in a small town with very few Jews, it was incumbent on each Jewish family to commit to the Jewish community, because without that commitment, it meant that someone could not say Kaddish for a loved one, or as there might not even be a minyan. It meant that my parents were by default Jewish educators for the non-Jewish community in which we lived and for the Jewish community. It meant sending us to Camp Ramah so we would know what it meant to live on Jewish time and to have connections with Jewish peers. And it meant standing up for who we are and what we believe as Jews. Many school years, my father, a pediatrician, not a lawyer, would stand before the Board of Education, articulating why the Establishment Clause and the principle of separation of church and state was a fundamental right in the United States. He would explain patiently to the choir teacher why songs in the name of Jesus were not acceptable as part of the school choir program, and why prayers in public school programs were unconstitutional. My father modeled for me that as a minority, we have a responsibility to other minority communities, and we must have moral courage to do what is right, not what is comfortable. That meant if I came home with a problem that I had identified, he would ask me, "Well, Rachel, what are you going to do about it?" And that was my charge to do. My father believed that one individual had the capacity to make meaningful change, and through that change, create a better and more just world. I learned these lessons from my father's own actions as he modeled this behavior, and I saw firsthand the impact he made. Not only did he model this, but we read books together about the pantheons in Jewish history. Theodore Herzl, Golda Meir, David Ben-Gurion. We read the Pushcart Wars and the Wise Men of Chelm at night, taking turns reading one page each. These were the stories and ideas my father wanted me to carry inside of me, the stories of our people. It was also my father's perseverance that made him love solving math and chemistry challenges. My father loved wrapping his brain around difficult math equations and immersing himself deeply in the mathematical thinking needed to solve challenging problems. He never gave up and tackled these questions with enthusiasm and curiosity, not because he solved them perfectly the first time, but because the deep thinking that was needed and the focus that was required took grit and perseverance. This is one of the reasons why my father loved his pediatric practice and taking care of babies and children. Babies and children are not always able to communicate what is wrong or what hurts, and that is where the problem lies. And this would bring energy to my father as he was determined to understand what was the underlying issue and methodically think through the symptoms in order to ease the child's discomfort and pain. I used to make rounds with my father at the hospital, probably breaking every official HIPAA rule today. It was during those rounds I heard how my father spoke to parents who were distressed as their child lay sick in a hospital bed. I saw the empathy he expressed while remaining calm and confident about his course of action as he articulated the medical plan for the child. I saw him ease parents' worries and offer more than knowledge, but deep compassion and chesed, loving kindness. And in many ways, his real joy in life demanded him digging deeper to find the grit and perseverance within himself every time he mounted his bicycle and rode the mountainous terrain of Northeast Tennessee. My father loved the open road. He found contentment in pushing himself to make it up the hills and to the top. When my siblings and I or his grandkids would bike with him, he had a simple mantra: make it to the next telephone pole, make it to the next mailbox, make it to the next driveway, make it to the next tree, and make it to the next fence. And then, before you knew it, you were at the top of the hill. Slow and steady, never giving up, pushing down on the pedal and grinding deeply just to keep moving bit by bit. That sense of drive and purpose was the foundation of everything he did in his life. He didn't expect perfection, but he did expect us to never give up, to give it our very best in all that we did, and to display grit and give everything we had, whether it was on the field, the hills of the road, the essays we were drafting, or in our commitment to the Jewish people. And for all of this, I am deeply grateful.